can ring in 0345 6060 973. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
So there I was at home last night, snowed in, which is why Ben Kentish was presenting the programme, and a very good job he did too. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to switch on Global Player and watch this as a consumer. And then I thought, I can watch it on my television as well on YouTube. So there I was on my massive television with sort of Ben Kentish and the cross-question panel. It's great watching it as well as listening to it. If you've never tried to watch us, do have a go on Global Player, or you can find us on the LBC YouTube channel and watch us on your normal television. Let's go to our first caller. It's Jonathan in Keighley. Hello, Jonathan. Oh, it's a text. Sorry, apologies. We normally start off with a call. Would tackling the asylum application problem turn things around for Rishi Sunak and the Tories in the polls? Well, this is what we've been talking about for the last hour on the programme. The Tories 20% behind, looking at a majority for Labour of 314 seats at the next election, according to the latest opinion poll. But Rishi Sunak has announced some new policies on immigration, particularly from Albania. Alec, Shelbrooke, is that going to be the so-called silver political bullet?
I don't think there's any such thing as a silver political bullet. I think there are a lot of things that have got to be sorted out, and obviously the Prime Minister made a statement today, which I thought in myself was unusual for a Prime Minister to come and make a statement in a specific policy area like that. So I think that shows the level at which this is being dealt with and being taken seriously. I do think it will be exceptionally damaging to the party if it isn't sorted out, or at least is made progress on. So the Prime Minister's obviously outlined a whole host of things today, and we'll see how that actually comes into fruition and operates, rather than will it actually turn the fortunes around, because in all of these issues the proof is going to be in the pudding.
Is it fair to single out Albanians as a nationality here?
Well, I think where the Albanian side of it's been singled out is because you do have thousands and thousands of Albanians coming from a safe European country, whereas there are lots of other routes coming from a lot of other people. And this specific area with the Albanians seems to be right at the very heart of the criminal enterprises in terms of how they can make the most money. And I think that, being able to do that deal with the Albanian government to send people back, which of course the other European countries do, and I think that's the important point, does mean that it's a separately dealt with situation compared to, say, people coming from Middle East, North Africa and areas like that.
Ella Whelan.
In a word, no. I don't think that the government trying to claw back some support through this announcement is going to work. And actually, I think it's pretty dangerous to use and abuse the issue of immigration to try and score points in an upcoming election, or try to claw back some support, because the whole, as the conversation that you've just had before we came on for Cross Question has evidenced, the issue of immigration is pretty complicated. There's the asylum system, which is obviously not working whatsoever, whatever way you look at it, even if you're for more liberal immigration, as I am. I think too many people who are of my mind fall back on the kind of lazy argument that these are all just asylum seekers, and aren't you such a nasty person for questioning them, when in actual fact we should be brave and say that what we really need to be doing is arguing for a more liberal immigration system, because lots of these, as far as I can see it, lots of these young Albanian men are, lots of them aren't coming because they're fleeing modern slavery or the rest of it. They're coming because they can't make a decent life for themselves in their own country, and they're coming to make a decent one for themselves here. And I think that's a very laudable thing. I actually think that's a very human thing, and there should be routes and means for them to do that legally and properly. And I think our points-based... But there aren't. So it's
there are routes for them to do that legally and properly.
Not if you are not if you're basically of the working class of Europe, because our points-based system here is incredibly stringent. It blocks out the kind of young Albanian men who don't speak English and don't have the equivalent of A levels, and that's kind of in direct contradiction to the fact that lots of the jobs that the government talks about us needing to do, whether that's picking fruit or wherever it is, driving HGV vehicles, you don't need an A-level to do. And so I think we need to have a much more holistic, much more ideas-based discussion about immigration and say, what is it that we want? And the British public, by the way, are not that simplistic. I mean, if you look at the kind of the response to the Windrush scandal, the response to discussions around Brexit, for example, we know that our feelings about immigration are complicated. We've welcomed with open arms loads and loads of Ukrainians. This is a kind of issue that I think needs to be unpicked and cannot just be made so simplistic as a kind of means to climb up the polls.
Okay, Joe Caulfield.
Well, it seems very rude to just pick on one country and go, well, we won't have those people, and to say Albanians like that. It's to me, just like very childish politics that he stood up saying, oh, no, I'll definitely get points for saying this because,
when you have so many, and the proportion of people who are coming over the channel, about a quarter are coming from Albania, which is, we're told, a safe country. Surely you have to talk about that.
Yeah, and it does make sense why they're coming. So they're saying, raising that Ella was saying, because these are young men. There are going to be criminal elements in everybody, but these are young men looking for work. And the one thing, like, even though I'm a comedian, I often do like events, and there'll be business people who know about things. And the one thing they always talk about is they need workers. And we need to have immigration sorted. And it's also years of sort of nasty atmosphere.
What they mean is they want cheap workers.
Well, they don't have any. So they want workers. That's what we need. But I do think it's also just years and years and years of immigration being used as this, people will get votes if we demonise people, and we don't have a good system. And we could really benefit ourselves by getting in the people that will be useful to us. And also, these people that are so if they've got the gumption to do this, then that's who we want.
Okay. Charlotte Nichols.
I mean, I think right at the centre of this, and what we often forget in the debate, is that this is human beings that we're talking about. And I think that, particularly the way that the immigration issue as a whole, but particularly when it comes to asylum, is often talked about, I think we really lose that human element in this. But when it comes to, Rishi Sunak's election fortunes, actually, I don't think that this is the number one issue that people are concerned about at the moment. Clearly, it's an issue that is of concern, but the number one thing that is coming up when I'm out on the doors in Warrington speaking to the people that I represent is people who really don't know how they're going to get to the end of this year financially, who are dreading in April or in May or in June next year when their mortgage comes up for renewal, what the new rates are going to be. People that are really worried about how they're going to put food on the table or pay for Christmas. Actually, that real cost of living crisis, which was something that existed anyway, but was absolutely turbocharged by the 44 days that Liz Truss was Prime Minister.
We're not kind of talking about that?
No, but
we may do later.
No, but you asked about, whether Rishi Sunak fixing the asylum issue is the thing that's going to change their fortunes, and it isn't, because actually I don't think that, as I said, that's the number one concern for people right now. I think it is the cost of living crisis, and until they get a grip on that, everything else that they're doing
but as a government, you can't say, well, we recognise the cost of living crisis is the most important thing, so therefore we're going to concentrate on that to the exclusion of everything else. You've got to be able to solve all the problems that are facing the country, and clearly there is a big issue here.
Absolutely, and I'm not saying that any of the other issues facing the country should be ignored, but politics is the language of priorities at the end of the day. And if the government's priority isn't what the country's number one priority is at the moment, I think people will understandably ask questions about, what we're choosing to spend government time discussing.
Alec, is that a fair point, that maybe the Prime Minister should have come to the House of Commons to talk about what really is on people's minds at the moment, and that is the cost of living crisis?
Well, of course, you did have the financial statement, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And I think, my very first answer to this was, if the specific question you asked Ian about will it change the polls, and I said it's not about that, it's part of the mix. You've got to deliver on things, and it's a whole host of things. So, backing up what you're just saying is that it's one of many things going to the original question. And in terms of the cost of living crisis, yeah, absolutely, that is there. And I go back, and I said this on your show, I think, Ian, a long time ago, that as far back as February, March time, when I was on the doors, people were really worried then about the doubling of the energy prices. And of course, the energy price cap is in place at that £2,500 at the moment. And that has made a big difference to how people budget forward. But those pressures that are building in terms of gas, in terms of oil, in terms of fertiliser, and this is something we talk about, the grain coming out of Ukraine, but it's not often talked about the fertiliser. When I was in Washington last week at National Defence University, one of the things that they were talking about there was that the yield of crops which are going to come out of the Midwest next year are going to be greatly reduced because they can't get hold of the fertilisers. And if they can get hold of the fertilisers, by manufacturing them, they're doing that at an expensive cost. So this is a long process going through, and therefore, in many ways, I am really sort of agreeing what Charlotte's saying, is that it's not just it's the most pressing issue, it's going to carry on being a pressing issue, and it's got to be dealt with each step of the way, and things will change. But equally agreeing with you, Ian, it shouldn't be the only thing to deal with. There are many things to deal with. And in terms of the fortunes of the party, it's simply, there's 2 years to an election, there's a lot to deal with. And yeah, I've seen this opinion poll today which says we get 65 seats. I've also seen an opinion poll today that says we're only 13 points behind. So pays your money, takes your choice. Well, compared to 25 points, that's progress.
Ella, widening this out a bit, do you think it is actually possible for the Conservatives to recover this opinion poll lead? I mean, the precedents are not good, are they?
No, and I think, there's discontent with the Conservative Party within the public. For all the reasons, we'll be here all night if I list them all. But, fundamentally, the promises of 2019, which I think did really excite a lot of people who had never been interested in the Conservatives before, have been squandered, over the years. And the party then really doesn't, the party now doesn't, to me, at all reflect the party then. And the second point is, never mind the public, internally, I mean, they're killing each other, they're eating themselves. You hear kind of briefings and whispers and gossip from one MP to the next MP every day about splits and who's a favourite. And it's a bit like, Westminster at the best of times is a bit like a schoolyard, but it really is at the moment.
Is that how it feels at the moment to you, Alec?
It's always been like that. I mean, look what's going on in the SNP. Look to a certain extent what's said in the Labour Party. I mean, all parties are like this. You
come now. At the moment, with the fact that you've had, I've lost count of how many prime ministers you've had. How many you yourself said that you've been in a role, half a minute. This is a government that doesn't know what it stands for anymore. And to come back to the asylum seeker question, I mean, there is the intricacies of a discussion about the immigration debate and how you deal with it and how many people you let in and blah, 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 the technicalities of it. But also, I think a lot of people watching this and watching the crisis of small boats, even someone like me who's, liberal on immigration, you look at that and you see this is a system that's out of control. And, the question is, can the government do anything right, even on the basis like this? We know that one of the main problems within the Home Office, going back to, as I mentioned, the Windrush scandal, is just simply a case of people not being able to process paperwork. And, Rishi Sunak's promising more staff increases. That's happened many times before. I mean, there was 500 people promised, I don't know, when was it, back in 2021 or something like that. It only amounted to 300. We've been here before with this, and I'm afraid to say there's nothing, if the Tories go into free fall and fail at the next election, I'm not very hopeful for the Labour Party either, because what's Labour's position on immigration? I mean, I don't see it as radically any different.
Can I just say in that, because I've made this comment before, and I think you make a very important point about the whole immigration system, how it happens. And I do think that what really would be radical, what should be looked at, is that the functions of the Justice Department go back into the Home Office, and all immigration comes out of the Home Office into its own department to have the full focus in that area, because it is taking a huge amount of time.
It's just
and this
the
problem,
isn't it?
well, you say that, but we're going back to 2006 when John Reid said it wasn't fit for purpose. We've now had Labour government, coalition government, Conservative government, minority government, Conservative government, lots of different governments, lots of different prime ministers, lots of people saying they want to do something about it, and it's still the same, Ian, if not getting worse. So maybe it needs a totally different approach.
Just before we go to a break, Joe Caulfield, is this manna from heaven for a stand-up comedian? This year must have given you so much material.
Well, it's really annoying because people always say that as though it's funny, as though we think there's nothing better than the government being terrible and the country going down the pan, and we go, oh, great, this is hilarious. It's not hilarious. It's awful. And also because people go, oh, hoping you'll make it funny for them. Yeah. But it doesn't change the facts of everything to go, I really can't make this funny.
And is it a risk as a comedian? Because obviously, I suppose people imagine that most people who go to comedy, it may be broadly on the left, but there are more and more right-wing comedians.
I think we discovered in Brexit during those years quite quickly that it was extremely divided. And those days are going, unless you're in certain little clubs where you'll go, yes, that'll be a more lefty audience. It's just people who want comedy. Yeah. And quite quickly people realise, we don't know which side these people are on. You can't tell. And then people didn't want to be lectured and felt very protective of their views, which side they were on Brexit. And people were called out, just like, I don't want to hear this. I've had people when they've got, shout comedians, not in the normal heckle way, just going, this isn't what we want, because we want to sit here and not argue with each other. It was like escaping that division by going to comedy. So it's very different. Unless, if you're going to go and see Mark Thomas, you know what Mark Thomas is going to say, and you're all in the same thing together. The comedy now, it's more difficult because you're trying to sort of find out what is the common ground that we all do have. Because we all want the same thing.
Even Jeff Norcott, who comes on this programme quite a lot, he kind of made his name as Britain's only right-wing comedian. There's quite a few others now. But he's gone a bit lefty. Well, not lefty, but...
I never thought he was that right-wing. I would watch him and go,
he's a sensible right-wing, a bit like myself, I would say.
I know we're up against it, Ian, but just to say, I haven't seen it, but I read the review of Peter Kay's new thing, and at a very specific point in there said there was no satire, it was all just about modern life. There was no politics in it at all, and it was bringing the house down. So I think the idea that comedy has to always be satirical and making that current affairs comment, I don't think is true.
Right, we will move on in a second. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Jen's
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
With us in the studio, Conservative MP for Elmet and Rothwell, which is where?
Just outside Leeds, up in West Yorkshire.
I'm coming to perform in Leeds in, when is it, March?
Give me a date, I'll come and see
with Jackie Smith. We're doing our For the Many Life.
Where are you doing that?
At the Carriage Works.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very good.
Good venue. Excellent.
Yeah, it's great, Millennium Square.
Alec, Shelbrooke, that is. Charlotte Nichols is Labour MP for Warrington North. No plans to come to Warrington in the foreseeable, I'm afraid, but that could change.
Let yourself down, because Parr Hall in Warrington just won Best Gig Venue in the UK.
OK, we'll try and fit that one in. Joe Caulfield, stand-up comedian. Where's your favourite comedy venue? The place where you go and you think we're going to get a good crowd here? No question.
I would say there's two I would pick. Hot Water in Liverpool and the Comedy
I performed
Store.
there.
Oh, did you?
At the Labour Party conference, Jackie Smith and I, we had Johnny Reynolds, who turned out to be a stand-up comedian. Who knew? It's a great venue. It's like it's, how can I put this? It smells a bit like a sauna.
And they're packed in, low ceiling,
absolutely.
really close to you.
Absolutely loved
and what I really like also, it's got, I mean, Liverpool's such a great going out town, and it's all ages that come to that show. I like to be, you know, boys in their 20s and then couples in their 70s, dressed up, night out, and they just love it. And they also, if you give a bit of banter in Liverpool, like they like to test you. But if you can play the game with them, then they're very like Glasgow, the same way, then they'll really go for you.
Jackie Smith and I will be back there this October. This is becoming just a plug for my many lives. Ella Whelan is here from Spiked Online. I don't know if you do any performing apart from here. No, you don't. No.
Please don't make me.
All right. I was going to invite you as a guest, but hey. Right, let's go on to our next question. It is a text question from Mike in Barnstaple in Devon. Mick Lynch looked rattled this morning. Is the RMT finally starting to realise that public support is ebbing away? I think this was an interview he did with Michelle Hussein, where he objected to her line of questioning. I can't remember what she wanted to know the answer to, but he certainly wasn't going to give it. Charlotte, what do you detect among your constituents about this? Because we did a phone-in a couple of weeks ago asking that very question. If do you still support the RMT in the way that you did at the beginning of the strikes? And the answer was yes. But I wonder if that's still the case.
Yeah, I think public polling has pretty consistently shown support not only for the RMT and the industrial action that they're taking, but also industrial action right across the board. Because I think most people can see that nothing's working and everything's pretty terrible at the moment, and people are bored of 10 years of pay restraint and stagflation. So I think there is that broad sympathy. I will declare an interest that my mum is an RMT member. She's on strike today. The figures that keep getting bandied around where they talk about train drivers' salaries, despite the fact that train drivers are all in ASLEF, not in RMT. My mum isn't on anything like that kind of salary. And she and the other people that haven't had a pay rise for years, while the cost of absolutely everything has been rocketing, feel like they've been left no other choice. She isn't some sort of, trade union militant or, whatever people like to try to characterise RMT members as. These are just normal people who've had enough, and they feel like, particularly the way that Network Rail and some of the senior executives have been treating them, they've had enough of that. And actually, the government does have the capacity to intervene. The Secretary of State, the Transport Secretary, has the ability to stop this strike at any time by giving the rail delivery route.
Seems to be getting on quite well with. It's a bit bizarre, this, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've cycled through, 4 Transport Secretaries in the last sort of 6 months or so. I think Mark Harper's probably the best of them so far.
I think, to be fair, it's 3.
Although that's not necessarily a very high bar in being the best of a bad bunch over recent months. But he does seem to be showing some willingness to actually sit down and talk to Mick Lynch and the RMT. And I think that is step number 1 in resolving this dispute. None of us want to see the strikes, least of all the people who are on strike. My mum doesn't want to be doing this. She wants this dispute to be finished, for them to have a fair settlement, and for her to be able to go back to work with a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and with none of her terms and conditions taken away as they're trying to do.
Now, Mick Lynch said today, regarding the Labour Party's attitude towards striking rail workers, there will be a lot of working class people who are asking when the election comes, where were you in 22? What were you doing to support working class people in their struggles? He suggested working class voters will abandon Labour for not backing the RMT and other workers.
Well, certainly I'm not concerned about that in my own constituencies. I've been on the picket line with my mum at Waterloo on the days when I've been in Westminster on strike days, and I've been with my constituents on the picket line at Warrington Bank Quay on the days when I've been in Warrington on strike days.
Do you think Labour should have been a bit more proactive in supporting these? strikers?
I think I can understand where the front bench position comes from, because ultimately, if we're a party that's wanting to be the party of government, we wouldn't, if we were in government, be standing on the picket lines, because we'd be in those negotiations with RMT, resolving the dispute. But I think for backbenchers like myself, going and showing support, whether it's to your postal workers, whether it's to your university lecturers,
Or your mum.
Or indeed my mum, who is,
Hello, Mum.
a lovely lady. Hi, Mum. I don't think it's very difficult to do. And I think that even for, Conservative MPs and MPs from other parties who might not necessarily back the strikes, that again, go down to the picket lines, go and talk to these people, hear what their concerns are, and let's get this dispute resolved. That's what we all want.
Joe Caulfield, it's interesting that the 63% of RMT workers rejected the last pay offer, and that compares with 89%, I think, for the previous one. Does that show that things are starting to fray?
I've no idea. I mean, I couldn't say that. The only thing I think about what's happened with Mick Lynch is it was very refreshing for people to hear somebody really talk about the whole process of the negotiation, because politicians seem to negotiate. I mean, I think if they were in business, they would be fired, because they seem always to do it from a very high standpoint of, we're the leaders, we're going to be tough. And that isn't the way people negotiate nowadays. But, there's courses you could all go on to learn. A lot of it is about, being emotive with people to understand their point of view. And I think his very straight talking, being as eloquent as he is, when again, he's not just saying, oh, I've got this thing I've rehearsed, which is what politicians do, and we all just sit there going, well, now you've just said the thing you've learned, and that's not helpful. I think I agree that mostly people do seem to be still very, very supportive, and more people are coming out on strike because things don't work. And a lot of it is also the not funding public services and getting rid of people. Like, this is an example of how things don't work. I had a letter telling me I owed tax when I knew I didn't owe tax, and it was a lot of money, and they also were going to do things, blah, blah. And then when I eventually got through to an actual person, he told me that they had new software which was sending out these letters automatically, and there was really not much he could do apart from write me in pen on his list of people he's keeping an eye on, so that I don't get more and more of these letters, which I did get one of these letters, but it's because there's not people there doing those jobs. And I think lots of people in their jobs going, this used to be a good job, and now it's not just money, it's the pay and conditions, and that I'm not able to do a good job in my place of work.
Ella Whelan.
Yeah, I don't know if Mick was rattled, more just probably a bit exasperated. Michelle Hussein was asking fair enough questions, and there was also the interview with Richard Madeley, which was probably
hilarious. That
slightly
was
less
funny.
highbrow, but
Most interviews with Richard Madeley are hilarious in my view. But
there is this. I think you can't underestimate how demonised the strikes have been. It's really a return of quite clear-cut class politics at the moment, which is, in one way refreshing, because I think we've skirted around the issue for many years. But in another way, there is this sort of suggestion by, many interviewers and people in the media, but also politicians, that the strikes are sort of, have come out of nowhere, that it's just kind of like greedy union barons, and it's the same old sort of people asking for more that can afford, that the government can afford, or the more than there's money in the pot. And actually, I think the powerful thing about these strikes is that they're not just within one industry. We're not in general strike territory even close to yet, and we're not anywhere near 1979 or anything like that. But there is a general sense. I think the reason why there's so much public support is that you have this pretty powerful message from those on the picket lines, which is, what do you expect me to do? I'm not a doormat to be walked over. They're pretty clearly the sums aren't adding up. There's inflation, there's cost of living crisis, and I literally cannot feed my family. So do you want me to roll over, or do you want me actually to assert my political viewpoint and withdraw my labour? And I think that's, even if you aren't working in those industries, even if your mum isn't working in those industries, there's a lot of scope for solidarity for that. But I do have to say that, never, the Tories are against it. That's fine. We understand that. That's what the Conservatives do. They clamp down on strikes. They, want to penalise workers left, right and centre. That's all right. We understand that. But I think it's not all right, but, I get it. the problem with the Labour Party, just to push, I hope that you're putting pressure on the front bench, is because it's a cop-out to say that, because we're a party in waiting, we're not going to do anything about it and we won't say what we really think. Everyone knows what Keir Starmer thinks about this. Kind of the rehearsal and the reinvigoration of a kind of Blairite idea of how to treat the working class is both with disdain and with distance, and that's exactly what he's doing on these strikes. It would cost him a great deal to come out and be in favour of the rail worker strikes or the posties or the nurses, because what that would be saying is the most important people in British political life are the working class, and the increasingly middle class and sort of introspective Labour Party is definitely not wanting to do that.
Alec Shelbrooke, the tactics that the government seem to be using are out of a 1980s playbook, talking tough, acting tough. But you're dealing with a very different breed of union leader now. They're not the same kind of so-called union barons as was in the 70s and 80s. They're very happy to come on shows like this and articulate why they're on strike in a way that they wouldn't have done several decades ago. And you've got government ministers basically hiding in their bunkers, not coming out and explaining things in a way that the public can understand. Where is this going to go from here?
Where's it going to go? I don't know. I mean, I'll make some sort of general comments from my point of view. And I think that, first of all, as you know, Ian, I was the only Conservative MP to actually vote against the strike-breaking statutory instrument that came through, because I think it's important that people do have their right to withdraw their labour if they're not happy in their terms and conditions. But that also means that negotiation has to happen on both sides. I mean, look, where the Labour Party are at, it's not for me, but I think it's telling that Labour have been honest when they've said, nurses, you're not getting a 19% pay rise under Labour. That is an honest position to take. Now, where does that leave the negotiations then with the government moving forward if the opposition party is saying, look, 19%'s not going to go there, so what are we coming back to the table with? Because that hasn't happened yet. So I think that there is a long way to go in all of these disputes. I think it's complex on the railways, because I think that we are dealing with an industry which has seen a significant drop-off in its most lucrative hours, and I think that's one of the big problems, and how that gets dealt with. And the cost of living crisis is deemed for a lot of outside pressures, but as we did see in the 1970s, if we chase inflation, we will increase it even further. So there is a fine balance to be had. But I've always been of the opinion that the most important thing you must do is negotiate. And it doesn't necessarily have to be done on the air.
But they're not doing that, are they?
I mean, well, apparently, as you said, Mark Harper and Mick Lynch are speaking. And I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be done on the airways, but I think progress does have to be made. But I think the worst thing that can happen, and I mean this from the government point of view and I mean it from the union point of view, is that you get entrenched and dug in and either side wants to give ground. And I think then you run into real problems. And I think there's been some of that in some of these areas. And I hope that doesn't become a pattern, Ian.
We'll come back to more of your calls and questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:34 news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
The Chancellor has refused to tell LBC whether he thinks nurses should be banned from striking ahead of walkouts this week. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, Jeremy Hunt says he thinks people are very angry with inflation, which the government is tackling. There are plans for new laws to prevent migrants who cross the English Channel from remaining in the UK. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, wants to fast-track the return of Albanian asylum seekers and double the number of case workers handling claims. American scientists say they've made a breakthrough that could revolutionise clean energy. Researchers have been able to recreate the reactions found inside a star, which released enough power to boil 10 to 15 kettles. LBC weather, sleet and snow in the south tonight. Snow showers affecting northern Scotland and far northeastern coasts. A low of -9.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Alec, Shelbrooke, Charlotte, Nichols, Joe Caulfield and Ella Whelan here with me answering your questions. Jane has texted in after a question on the RMT. Another presenter, I guess that's me, betraying British people by proposing the public are fed up of unions. I didn't say that at all. Well, no, we haven't, and we support them fully. No more Thatcherite vilification of people in poverty. Well, you're talking to the presenter who gives trade union leaders more of a platform on his show than any other show on UK radio. We did a 2-hour phone-in with Dave Ward the other day. We've had Christina McAnee from Unison on recently as well, doing an hour. You don't find that anywhere else on UK radio. Clinton is in Basildon. Hello, Clinton.
Oh, hi. My question to the panel is, do you think it's right for Sadiq Khan to impose the ULEZ charge on Greater London?
So this is the ultra-low emission zone, which is going to be rolled out to all 33 London boroughs in August 2023. At the moment, it's just the territory inside the North and South circulars. This is causing a lot of angst in people in outer London. Now, I don't know where you live, Joe, but I don't think we have any London residents on the panel. So. You are, Ella. Yeah. Right, let's start with you then.
I live in Hackney, which is the worst place for ULEZs and for LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, and clampdowns on driving. I think that the ULEZ, even in its inception, was a horrendous idea. It's a poor tax on Londoners, because at the moment, under ULEZ rules, the only way you can drive is if you have a car that's made recently enough, which is going to cost you a lot of money. If you had, governments previously advised people to buy diesel. Now diesel is like kind of poison and you can't have it. People have had to scrap their vehicles. My dad, who was a builder for many, many years, has had to retire, been forced to retire early because his van that was what he had to bring his tools around didn't meet the ULEZ requirements, and so he couldn't afford to work anymore. It's basically meant that getting around London has become impossible for people, and let's not go into the state of public transport in London. It's really not very good, even though it's much lauded. Trying to catch a train yesterday, or even days when there aren't strikes, is often near impossible, and buses are another story completely. But also, the Sadiq Khan seems to be blissfully unaware of what it means to get a big shop when you're a mum with 3 kids. Try doing that on a bus, please, Sadiq. It's impossible. You can't do that. And there's also a kind of a point about, the fact that a city is meant to be a place where cars can drive around. There is this obsession, particularly, I'm sick of it because it's particularly in Hackney, obsession with pedestrianisation in a way that, hampers people who need to get around with disabilities, for example, hampers families, as I've already mentioned. And also, it's not what a city does. A city is not a place that is pedestrianised. It's a hustling, bustling area that needs transport. My husband's a tree surgeon, and he comes home laughing all the time, telling me that he's, going up to price jobs with people with pro-ULEZ and pro-low traffic neighbourhood posters in their window. And he feels like asking them, how do you expect me to carry the tree away on my back or in my truck? So I think, never mind it expanding out to outer London, it should never have been implemented in the first place.
Charlotte Nichols, if it's coming to London, it may well come to Greater Manchester soon.
Well, obviously, the Greater Manchester Clean Air Zone is something that I know about. I have to say, as someone that represents Warrington, I couldn't really tell you anything about the ULEZ zone in London. But one of the things that was a real concern for us locally when the proposals were in place in Manchester was actually there are certain parts of my constituency which borders the Greater Manchester city region where actually to drive from one part of Warrington to another part of Warrington you actually briefly have to go through parts of Lee, for example, or other areas, Trafford, which would then fall into the clean air zone. So even though the start and end of your journey are both outside it, that period where you've been taken inside it, you then become eligible for charges. And, for people that are obviously living in Warrington but working in part of Greater Manchester, or, people who are doing jobs where they're picking up different jobs around the area where they may have to drive into it, again, getting caught. So, we were in sort of regular discussions with Andy Burnham's office until there was the decision to freeze the plans for now. But again, they were plans that were mandated by central government for Greater Manchester to introduce. So I think, when you look at the sort of devolution around the UK and some of the decisions that are being taken by metro mayors or, city mayors around the country, they're often doing it based on sort of ministerial directions set in Whitehall. And I think we have to be very clear with these things when you go back to, well, who ultimately is responsible for this? It's very easy to blame Burnham or to blame Sadiq, but, I doubt that, as was the case with our version
Sadiq
of
owns this. So this is Sadiq's pet, along with sort of making misogyny a hate crime and all the other stuff he talks about. This is his legacy project. He doesn't need any nudging from
hate crime for what it's worth.
He doesn't need a nudge from Whitehall or anything like that. This is like Sadiq Khan's raison d'etre to basically ban cars in London.
But I think he hasn't made. It's got to be mixed. Like, I used to live in London for years and years, and in Finchley. So then there was a time when I would drive. If I was doing a gig, I would drive into town and park. And this is where I say, I was a person who could be made to stop doing that because of congestion charge and because it got so expensive to park. So then I was like, I can use public transport. So if the public transport is good enough, people will then go, I'm going to do that, like they've done that in Germany, where, you can have free public transport, use it. But like Ella's saying, like her husband, he needs a van. Those people should not be penalised. So I think he's just thought of it in far too rigid a way when it can work if you can encourage lots of people who can use public transport. I mean, I would always, sometimes they'll send you a car for a job and I go, no, tube's much better way to get around in London. And I would always do that. But some people do need and they should not have to pay extra or have these special cars.
But you can't draw up rules here that just apply, that have lots of exceptions, can you? There's got to be a clearly understandable regulation.
Quite easily. You can prove what you do for a living and you go, OK, well, then you are an exception. Because otherwise, all what you see in central London is just rich people in cars outside shops, which is a ridiculous way for your city to end up being.
Yeah, well, I've driven in today for obvious reasons. Alec?
So it's interesting as a joke because it's not about central London. And I can see exactly the argument about in central London it's far easier to get on the tube, travel around. You often do all sorts of shows and they say we'll send you a car and it's like, no, I'll get on the tube, it's a lot quicker, it's a lot easier. But we're talking about all the areas in the 33 boroughs.
You know who the worst people for demanding cars are? Green Party politicians. It's true. It is absolutely true. I'm not going to name and shame, but you'd be very surprised. on that bombshell.
And I think that, let's be clear about what this is about. It's that if you live, I think we're talking about the 33 boroughs here, aren't we? So I think that takes into areas like Orpington, for example.
Yes. But these are going to be introduced into Bath, Birmingham, Bradford, Bristol, Portsmouth, Sheffield, Tyneside. So it's not
and
just
I'm just going to bring it back to Leeds in a second, but just to say, this is like getting in your car. Every time you get in your car, you're being charged, even if it's just go to the supermarket a mile from your house. It's not about coming into London. I think that's important.
Yeah.
In terms of Leeds, they were talking about low emission zone in the city centre, and then they dropped it. But if we were to take that example and they spread it all the way out, the A1 runs through my constituency. I mean, what's my constituency? And spoke about earlier on is actually the countryside between Leeds and North Yorkshire, and the A1 runs through the middle. So if you're on a journey up to Newcastle or something like that, you're going to play the low emission zone for the 20 miles of your journey on the A1 that pass through Leeds Authority area.
How that works?
This is where exactly.
Well, I'm very against that because I drive that way home to Edinburgh, so I'm very against
and it gets very complex,
yes.
Doesn't it? And I think that, I think Jo was right when she said about, she was driving into London for gigs and said, I'm not the sort of person doing that, and I changed that. But that's not what this is about. Because I don't disagree with you that if you do choose to drive in, you're going to have to pay for that because do you really need to do it? But this is about people who might be skirting right around the edge of outer London. People who probably don't even consider themselves living in London actually having to do this.
Terry has got a solution for you, Ella. He's in Hackney. He says, I live in Hackney E8. The perfect way around the ULEZ problem is to buy a vehicle that is 40 years old or older.
Yeah.
I drive a 1971 Triumph Herald and my car is exempt from ULEZ, MOT and tax. Can you buy builders, old tree surgeon vans that are...
I live in E8 as well, and if I was any good at cars, I'd probably be able to find you and find your car. But the thing about that is it's perverse that you can vintage cars cars are exempt from the ULEZ, and anyone who has a vintage car, I do not, I've got a little Vauxhall Caddy, knows that they cost loads of money to run.
VW Caddy, I think you'll find.
Is it? No, it's a little white van, and I don't know anything
Caddy
about...
vans are VW.
Yeah,
I used to have one.
I love it, and I love driving it, and the point I want to make is it's also, I think, if you want to kind of make a more philosophical point, driving is really enjoyable. There's a great history of the importance of freedom of driving, for working class people, also for women, to be able to get out and get in the car and go wherever you like. And I think we're starting to kind of dump on that, which is that, I love getting the bus, I love reading my book on the train, but I also like jumping behind the wheel and going somewhere.
But the impression given now by councils all over the country is our job in the transport department is to make your life as a driver as difficult as possible, and that should not be the case for public servants, in my view. But there we go. It's 8:48.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:51. I'm going to ask for brief answers so we can get in 3 questions in the next 9 minutes. More in hope than expectation, but anyway. Annie in Leicester says, England's chief nurse has hit out at the striking nurses union for being too hard-line in how few services will be provided during the walkout later this week, saying it could risk lives. Are the nurses simply going too far with their strike? Joe?
Oh, God, that's such a harsh thing to say of nurses, because I think they've thought so hard about this, and so many people, and everybody has anecdotal stories of people they know who work in the NHS, and it really has, been pushed against a wall, and they go, I can't do this anymore. And some of it is basically things like a friend of mine, and if you go to have your bloods done, she does your bloods, and she's like, I've basically been told I have to do more people in that hour, but I'd like to treat people like a human being, sit them down, make sure they're relaxed, answer any questions, but there isn't time for that. So it's so much of it is also about the stress of them knowing they're not able to do their job the way they want to do it. So you can't ever say they're going too far.
Charlotte?
It's an absolute nonsense, not least because the staffing levels that have been agreed during the strike as the sort of minimum staffing levels, actually they are regularly staffed less than that at the moment because of how difficult it is to fill up a full roster of nurses, given we've got a vacancy rate of about 120 to 140,000 within the NHS at the moment. They're actually going to be probably better staffed on strike days in some places than they are the rest of the time. That's why the nurses are going on strike, because they are sick of not being able to provide the quality of care that they want to be able to provide.
Alec?
I think, to keep it brief, Ian, is what I was saying earlier on about not falling into entrenched positions. And I think whether that's the comment made from the chief nurse or the negotiators at the bottom, I think, it is important.
You're starting to lose your voice, aren't you?
It's going out. It was completely gone on Sunday, and I thought I'd get through the show. The amount of water I'm getting, I'll clear it in a second. But I do think it's about not getting into those entrenched positions and making sure that you try not to use inflammatory language that puts people's backs up. I think that's very important.
Ella?
I think for too long, nurses and healthcare workers have been hamstrung by this kind of emotional blackmail that says that they can't exercise their power and their protest as workers because of the fact that the work that they do is involved in saving lives in comparison with, for example, parcels being late or trains not running on time, and they have to stay strong in the face of that and push back on that, because at the end of the day, they are workers who are doing an incredibly important job, but they are still, at the end of the day, just workers, and they need to be able to exercise those rights to the extent to which they see fit. And I actually think, there is an argument that they dampen the effectiveness of strike action by not going hard enough, but not perhaps going long enough. One of the criticisms I would make of some of these December strikes is that they're too all over the place one day here or there, and unlike previous periods of strike action in British history, you're more likely to have more of an effect if you stick with it for longer. Meeting nurses' demands, that we talked about this, I think Alec mentioned it a bit earlier, let's be real here. Meeting nurses' demands would amount to, I think it's about 10 billion, which is 6.5% of the NHS budget. Cut some diversity officers or something and find that money. It's not out of the realms of possibility to do that. I think that they're not asking for heaven and earth, they're asking for something very basic.
Right, another text question from Julie in Chesham. Polls show that 3 in 5 people now think negatively about Harry and Meghan. Is this all down to a tabloid campaign of hate? Julie, you've let me down because I don't really particularly even think this merits discussion, but we ask the questions that you want answered. Alec, you can be as brief as you like on this one.
I think I've got it back, Ian.
Okay.
Look, I've not watched it. Look, when the king ascended the throne, he wished his son love and hoped that they could build their lives abroad. I think that there's a lot of cynicism has gone on in the family. From Harry and Meghan's point of view, that they're trying to make money, they're into that system. But there's a lot of talk. I just haven't watched it, Ian. It's as simple as that. And I get a sneaking suspicion that the royal family are probably just a little tired of it all as well.
Charlotte?
I do think that a big part of it is around that kind of media campaign of hate towards them, because look at the way that Meghan and Harry get treated and look at the way that Prince Andrew gets treated. Fundamentally, I think that he's done a lot more wrong than Harry and Meghan have done, and yet you look at how they are vilified, and the way that he is, allowed to sort of broadly carry on.
Do you think he's also been...
I'm not sure I'm with you on this one, Charlotte. I think he's quite vilified.
I don't think he's vilified anywhere near the extent that he should be for the things that he's done. And I think he's been allowed to get away with it because the media have put the focus of that hate and attention on Prince, Meghan and Harry.
Joe?
Why would you pay someone 14 million quid for something you haven't done? Allegedly.
I've never been asked to. Joe?
Perhaps he had a PPE contract.
I think the press...
You should be the stand-up. Joe?
I think the British press were furious quite early on with Meghan because she wasn't delighted to be a princess, and they love Catherine because that's all she wants is to be a princess.
See, that's not my memory at all. I think the press were actually really pro her at the beginning.
At the very beginning, because she was being a nice princess. And I remember watching the wedding and going, she's going to get bored, because it's quite a boring life being a princess in Britain. You know, if you've had a life, which she has had a life. So I thought she's going to get bored. She doesn't want to live near Slough, does she? You know, dreadful.
I do apologise to our many listeners in the wonderful place called Slough.
And now I think they've gone too far, and they've misread the room, because, you know, now people have short of money, they don't want to watch their pity party.
Ella?
Yeah, they're whingers, and there's nothing that the British public like less than whingers, particularly whingers with eye-watering amounts of money and nice houses and all the rest of it. You know, the whole thing about the press is that, you know, it strikes me as sort of inconceivable that you can, on the one hand, say, we hate press attention, it's so awful, please just let me live my life in private, whilst airing your dirty laundry on Netflix. I mean, pick one and go with it. You know, if they want to be in the public eye, then sometimes the public eye isn't always on your side.
I think the Daily Star
deal with it.
The best approach to this, with sort of the blackout. You know, shy man doesn't want you to talk about his new show.
Now, I should add, been asked to say this. To be clear, in Prince Andrew's out-of-court settlement with his accuser Virginia Giuffre, he accepted no liability, and he's always strongly rejected any claims of wrongdoing. There, I've done my duty. Final text question from Sandra. After lots of people ended up in this exact situation earlier this week, if you had to end up on a snowed-in train overnight, who would you like to be stuck on it with? Now, there's an interesting one. I can think of plenty of people who I wouldn't want to be stuck on a train with. Anybody got a ready answer to that one to give the others time to think about it?
You, Ian.
Oh. That means, no, he just wants to.
No, it's because he's a West Ham fan.
Yeah, we're fellow Hammers.
We could moan about West Ham all evening.
Now, Joe Caulfield, you must use the sleepers to Edinburgh occasionally. I mean, do you have to sleep in the same sort of bit as somebody else?
I used it once and it was a disaster for me. I think I'm too tall. I felt like I was just lying in a tin can being thrown around. And then business people get up in the morning and do a day's work. But I just went straight home to bed.
Yeah, quite
felt
right.
like I had a hangover. It didn't work.
So who would you like to be stuck on a train with overnight?
I'd like to be on my own, definitely. Yeah. Because whoever it is going to be irritating after a while.
Charlotte?
Idris Elba.
Idris Elba. Ella?
Well, I'd inevitably now at this point, seeing as he's been born, be with my 9-week-old son. So I'd want my mum so that she can look after him. I can go get a drink from the bar, because he would be
Is that what she's doing
screaming.
tonight?
If she didn't live in Ireland, she'd be here. Yeah.
So you've left him at home alone?
No, he's with his dad. I think. Don't make me check my text.
You know, in all seriousness, though, I mean, I travel around the world a lot in the job I've got, and you expect delays and that, and I always have at least 2 books in my case with me, and literally in those situations I'm more happy just
and
to
they're
sit
both
down
mine,
and
aren't
read.
they?
Of course they are, Ian.
Excellent.
Available at all good bookshops this Christmas.
That's absolutely right. Thank you very much indeed to Charlotte Nichols, Joe Caulfield, Ella Whelan and Alec Shelbrooke. After the news, we're going to be talking about smoking, which we've actually done quite a lot over the last few weeks. There's a really interesting story from New Zealand, who've passed the world's first tobacco law to ban smoking for the next generation in New Zealand. If you're born after the 1st of January 2009, you can't smoke a cigarette, and that age will go up every year. And at some point over the next 60, 70, 80 years, smoking will be banned completely in New Zealand. Should we do the same? It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Chancellor has refused to say whether he believes nurses should be banned from going on strike. Nurses are due to walk out on Thursday in a row over pay.